Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley reporting from Washington, D.C. It's Friday, the 24th of August. And, of course, on Monday, we have the Republican National Convention. They've been going on since 1856. At the beginning, with Fremont in 1856, and with Lincoln in 1860 and 1864, they were pretty much the opposite of what they are today. In those days, this was a party with revolutionary aims. On a world historical scale, the Republican Party was the architect of the second and indispensable American Revolution, known as the Civil War, to wipe out the slave power conspiracy, to break the power of the slavocrats, and also to create one of the greatest land reforms ever seen, the Homestead Act, the Morrill Act, Justin Morrill, a great guy. So we got all that, but of course it's turned into its opposite, hasn't it? Now we're going to get Romney. It's interesting that in 1856, one of the first things the Republican Party did was to say, we want to put an end to the two relics of barbarism, the twin relics of barbarism, says the Republican platform of 1856, slavery and polygamy. Actually, I think they put polygamy and slavery, meaning Confederates and Mormons. And now the Mormons are going to take over the Republican Party. What a shame, how things turn into their opposites through all kinds of influences. Now, first of all, let me urge you to look at tarpley.net by about the middle of next week, Wednesday, Thursday, around the time that Mitt makes his acceptance speech. We should be offering a written report composed under the pressure of obvious time constraints, but still a report on Bishop Romney's tradition. Bishop Romney. He is a bishop. Now, there is a quibble about what it means to be a bishop. A Mormon bishop is apparently in charge of a single church or ward, I think. The Mormon bishop looks more like a parish priest. He's the one who's going to intervene directly on individuals and harass them, guide them, whatever you want. But then Romney also became a stake president. And the stake, meaning a stake in the tent of Zion, the stake president that's a bishop in normal Western civilization. The stake is the equivalent of a diocese in traditional Christianity. And if you're the head of a diocese, that makes you a bishop. So Romney really is a bishop by any count. He's called a bishop, but again, the Mormon bishop is a step below what we have in Western civilization. But then becoming a stake president, that makes him a full-fledged bishop. So we want to look at Bishop Romney's tradition, the one he claims to love, the one he claims has shaped him, the one he claims to be devoted to, doesn't want to talk about, but nevertheless, there it is. So that's number one. Check tarpley.net at the middle of next week, and we hope to have something to throw into the world historical scales. The other thing here is, naturally, we got an array of television reports on the Mormons. I just mentioned three. ABC News this past week had two separate segments, a two-part profile of the Mormon religion in the ABC Evening News. Of course, these are all cover-ups. Then we had last night, Thursday, the 23rd of August, we had Rock Center with Brian Williams and Harry Smith, Mormon in America. And we also had the BBC with John Sweeney. This was somewhat more aggressive. Well, after NBC, ABC, and BBC, try tarpley.net, and you will see that it's quite different. And it's not so superficial. It's not such a meager public relations account. because there's a cover-up going on. But the one thing that emerges from this that is not hidden is that we're approaching the Mormon moment. The Mormon moment, a moment of affirmation, a moment of, getting back at people. We have to look into this. Therefore, you have to ask yourself whether you want to be part of a Mormon moment, whether there's any place for you in a Mormon moment. So we'll be dedicating quite a bit of today's program to this. Now, the other thing is, if you're in Western Europe on Friday, August 31st, I am likely to be speaking in Amsterdam at the Magneet Festival. Magneet, M-A-G-N-E-E-T, the Magneet Festival, the Magnetic Festival in Amsterdam, Netherlands, Holland, Friday, 31st of August. Should be with my old friend Daniel DeWitt. Daniel DeWitt will be there with me, I believe, and this is likely to be the only European appearance this season. So if you're interested, come on out, and I'll try to have some books. I'll try to have some other things going on. It looks like it's going to be an interview about Syria, and then a presentation about the world economic crisis and what to do about it. So, two things. Again, middle of next week, if you're anywhere in the world, take a look at tarpley.net. There should be then the announcement, indeed the availability, that this report on the Mormons has started to ship, Bishop Romney's tradition, what it's likely to be called, and then the Magneet Festival, Friday, the 31st of August. Do check up in advance, call in advance. It's not 100%, but it's becoming more and more likely as the days pass. All right, so here we are, a couple of days before the quadrennial Republican convention. What do we have? Well, first of all, from Obama, probably the most explicit war threat that we've had from Obama in quite a while, certainly the most explicit war threat that we've had from Obama about Syria. This was one of his, was actually the White House appearance where he was taking advantage of the ravings of the reactionary, really barbarian ideologue Todd Akin, the Tea Party fanatic, Tea Party barbarian from the Republican Party. We don't need to go into that guy's raving remarks, but this is what brought Obama out, right, to get the most out of this. But in the course of appearing to talk about the barbarian Akin, he also got off a war threat, which was that if the Syrian government moves or uses chemical weapons, then the U.S. will attack, invade, go in with troops. Obviously, a sickening reminiscence, a sickening atavism of the Mad Dog Bush, the younger administration, right? The chemical weapons in Iraq, the WMD of Saddam Hussein. Here it is again. The red line is supposedly the chemical weapons, and we've got stories now that U.S. special forces all around the Middle East are on high alert to intervene in Syria. Now, again, this may not be the cakewalk that these forces have somehow become accustomed to. It might become much more complicated than they think. All good reasons not to do it, to back off from this stuff. The other obvious potential here is you've got al-Qaeda terrorists now running around there in large numbers. You've got Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. You've got the various Liwa groups, the brigades, the Islamic brigades, and so forth. If they get a hold of some chemical weapons and shoot them off, then that becomes a perfect false flag Gulf of Tonkin. So a word to the wise is sufficient on that. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Again, take a look at tarpley.net sometime around the time of Romney's acceptance speech, assuming it's on schedule. And also, if you're in Western Europe, anywhere near Amsterdam, you may want to stop by the Magneet Festival Friday, the 31st of August, because I'm apparently on the program. Naturally, the question that arises here, that's been pointed out by many wags, is whether the Republicans, the party of God, have lost the mandate of heaven because of Achan, because of the hurricane, and because of all these other problems that they have. So that we'll leave that to the soothsayers, but they may have lost the mandate of heaven. Therefore, serious though is Obama with his red line. Now, there was a high-level conference of Syria and Russia in the past week, and in the course of this, Syria delivered solemn assurances, guarantees to Russia that there would be no use of chemical weapons. What you can see right now in Syria is a radicalization of the civil conflict. It may by now actually be a civil war after all of those death squad fanatics have been shipped in, right? Thousands upon thousands of Al-Qaeda killers and their related hangers-on and fellow travelers. They've been shipped in. So it may be reaching the proportions of a civil war. We don't really know what the hold of the death squads is on that area north of Aleppo, between Aleppo and the Turkish border. But if they're able to hold an area of ground, no matter what it is, then that might qualify as a civil war. There are other definitions of civil war. Take a look at the French wars of religion in the 1570s, 1580s, and you'll get another view of what a civil war looks like. It doesn't have to be as organized as the American Civil War was. But in any case, here's the thing. Think about the United States 150 years ago. It took quite a while to radicalize the U.S. Civil War. At the beginning of the American Civil War, there were people, notoriously McClellan is such a person, right? George B. McClellan. He wanted a negotiated peace. He did not want to use total war methods. He wanted some kind of cabinet warfare that would satisfy everybody's honor and then lead probably to the separation of the Confederacy and then to a military coup by McClellan in Washington, because that's what his clique talked about the whole time. Unfortunately, he couldn't win enough victories to puff himself up. So it's only after about 1.5 years of the American Civil War, starting in April of 1861, and then by September, late September, early October, you get Lincoln making the key decision, the Emancipation Proclamation, the ending of slavery in the Confederacy, in the rebellious states, then becomes a war aim. And this, of course, means that it's a revolutionary war to wipe out slavery, to save the Union, to be sure, but to wipe out slavery now is essential because that's the only way you can save the Union, but that's also then the morality of the war, and this then leads to a much more radical approach in 1863, 64, and 65. Now, if you look at Syria, I also noticed this when I was there in November 2011, that at the beginning there was this reticence, right, that Assad had even given out orders in the very beginning not to fire on demonstrations. The troops were basically forbidden to use any weapons. There was also a great fear of using helicopters and airplanes, lest that become the pretext for a foreign no-fly zone. So these moments of reticence have fallen by the wayside as you go more and more towards total war. But this is it's a lawful process, regrettable, deplorable. On the other hand, the responsibility goes to the door of the NATO terrorist controllers who have sent these people in and supported them and paid for them and done their diplomatic dirty work. So the period of about 1.5 years from March of last year, 2011, till now, compares pretty much to the April 1861 to September 1862, and that's the announcement then of the Emancipation Proclamation, which then becomes effective on January 1st, 1863. So this is what's happening with Syria. At the same time, the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, is increasing its attacks. Now, the naivete of Erdogan and Davutoglu is unfortunate. They're blinded by ambition, blinded by vanity. They think that Assad controls the PKK. I'm sorry. Go and look online. Avigdor Lieberman, the Israeli foreign minister, less than a year ago, last September, came out and said the Turks have antagonized Israel because in the wake of the Mavi Marmara, the Gaza flotilla, the Turks have done this, that, and the other thing. Therefore, said Avigdor Lieberman, we Israelis will support the PKK. Notorious is also Danielle Mitterrand, the boudoir under Tonton Mitterrand, François Mitterrand, president of France in the 1980s. In her boudoir, she would receive all kinds of people, Baader Meinhof, terrorists, God knows what, but in particular PKK terrorists. Seymour Hersh has pointed out that the CIA supports the PKK, provided that they're attacking Iran. The Greeks, NATO, have supported the PKK for obvious anti-Turkish reasons at various times. So you get the idea. There are all kinds of people who have a piece of the PKK. Obviously, the British are the most basic of all, going back 150 years or what, to the time that David Urquhart was the British ambassador to Constantinople back in the 1830s and 1840s. So, the PKK, the Turkish leaders, Erdogan and Davutoglu, are acting like a small boy who has brought down a beehive or a hornet's nest or a wasp's nest and is now getting stung and loudly complains that the hornets and the wasps shouldn't be doing that to him. Dear Erdogan, dear Davutoglu, this is your own handiwork. The blowback in this was so obvious. You have a country, again, with that important secular versus Islamist split right down the middle. You've got a very significant Alawite population in the tens of millions. You've got a very significant Kurdish population. It makes no sense to engage in this adventurism. On an interesting press TV debate, which you can see on Tarpley.net, one of the experts in the debate pointed out that Davutoglu and Erdogan did not expect that there would be so much international support for Syria, that Assad would be so tenacious, that Assad would have so much support, because inside the country, that is the indispensable part of it. They thought it would go more or less like some mixture of Tunisia, Egypt, and maybe some bombing a la Libya. But it's turned out to be quite different. Time to cut your losses, Erdogan. Cut your losses, pull back, and we'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Check Tarpley.net always, and in particular in the coming week, if you want to learn more about the Mormon moment coming down on you. And if you're in the Western Europe, Western Europe, the Magnate Festival at Amsterdam, Friday, August 31st, looks like I'll be there. Now, the other big thing, a couple of other things to mention. The Israelis are going wild again with threats. This is always difficult to evaluate. They've cried wolf a lot, but again, it's all it takes is one time. So take it seriously, given that Netanyahu is, after all, a political desperado with his octet, his war cabinet, split down the middle 4 against 4, with a possibility of bringing in one more vote to try to break the tie in favor of war. He's got an institutional rebellion on his hands. The Israeli generals don't want it. They regard Netanyahu as an unprincipled adventurer. But God help us if we get Romney, his bosom buddy, joined at the hip since 1976. That might tip the balance so that Bibi will go into a megalomaniac phase and start lashing out. This we don't want to be there for. Now, we've also got this coming week, the non-aligned. This is very, very interesting. I would regard this now as in the wake of that important Iran consultative conference on Syria. The Tehran consultative conference on Syria was held 2 weeks ago now, with 30 countries, right? And half the world, that is to say Russia, China, India, Iran, Indonesia, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Venezuela, Cuba, Belarus, and so forth. It gets up to more than half of the land area and more than half of the population of the world. Those 30 countries, all of them on a very simple platform: national independence, non-interference in internal affairs, and national dignity. In contrast to what Brzezinski thinks, you don't get dignity by being the wretched denizen of a rump state, failed state, secessionist, mini-state, micro-state entity. That gets you nowhere. You want to be a citizen of a big, powerful, modern nation-state, powerful, with economic development, able to fight off ExxonMobil, J.P. Morgan Chase, Halliburton, and the rest of them. So we've got to see what this mood here at the non-aligned will be. It starts on Sunday in Tehran. Now, the U.S. is already freaking out because look at all these people that are going. Ban Ki-moon is going to Iran for the non-aligned. Now, that's, this is now 2/3 of the world in terms of the number of countries. That it used to be the group of 77, but now it's about twice that. So this is the non-aligned, the great tradition going back in particular to the 1975 non-aligned in Colombo, Sri Lanka, Ceylon. But now we've got Ban Ki-moon going to Iran, Morsi of Egypt going to Iran, and you've also got Brahimi of Algeria, the replacement for Kofi Annan. Brahimi has at least 1 point going for him. He wants to include Iran in the Syrian talks. So there's a step in the right direction. But let's look a little bit more at the possibilities here with the non-aligned. It would be good if they came out with a resolution, let's say, condemning Saudi Arabia and Qatar and maybe the United Arab Emirates and NATO for fomenting this rebellion. Let's see what goes on. So who's going to be there? From Iran, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. North Korea, Kim Jong-nam, President of the Supreme People's Assembly. Afghanistan, President Hamid Karzai. Venezuela, President Hugo Chavez. Sudan, President Omar Bashir. Zimbabwe, President Robert Mugabe. Tunisia, Foreign Minister Rafiq Abdeslam. Azerbaijan, President Ilham Aliyev. Egypt, President Mohamed Morsi. Libya, Foreign Minister Ashur Khayal. No gathering is perfect. South Africa, Foreign Minister Nkoana Mashabane. Lebanon, Michel Suleiman. Nobody's perfect. India, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. Australia, how did they get in? Who invited them? UN Ambassador Gary Quinlan. They're not aligned like let your imagination run wild. United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, and so forth. So this is quite a gathering. How aggressive they can be. The 1975 one was quite aggressive. They demanded debt relief. They demanded a new world economic order. They demanded economic development for everybody. And a lot of them were then couped, right? Indira Gandhi was assassinated within a few years, Mrs. Bandaranaike was brought down with a coup, and so forth. From Afghanistan, we're getting all kinds of stories about these insider attacks. General Dempsey's plane was damaged. Last days of Pompeii. Why not get the U.S. forces out while the getting is good? Let's liquidate this. This is Obama could help himself. Obama could make a massive step forward by essentially beginning an orderly withdrawal at with all deliberate speed, so that it doesn't generate its own casualties and problems among civilians or among the forces themselves. But put an end to this adventure, after all, started by Mad Dog Bush the Younger, based on the 9/11 mythological accounts. Now, in Europe, Samaras, you remember, we followed the Greek elections very closely. Samaras had to run against his own austerity plan. He couldn't go before the Greek voters and say, I support the Troika, I support the IMF austerity memorandum, the memorandum of understanding, the conditionalities. Samaras had to say, no, that's no good anymore. We've got to get a surcease, right? It's got to be drawn out over time. We want to delay. Well, we've just had this most feckless meeting of the French-German combo. I am sure de Gaulle and Adenauer are horrified by this impotence, right? This fecklessness, the stubborn, impenetrable stupidity of Mrs. Merkel, and now the cowardice and weakness of the feckless Hollande, a lightweight now, we can see. They're agreeing that Greece must stay on the austerity timetable. This is killing people for unscientific, baseless reasons. Austerity causes mortality and morbidity. To put it bluntly, austerity kills. The Greeks have had enough of this, and it's not working. The more austerity you have, the bigger the deficit gets. Ron Paul will never understand, but the Greeks have understood. Austerity doesn't work in its own terms. It does not bring the budget into balance. This cannot work. So Hollande and Merkel have had their say. Right now, Samaras has no cover. Now, here is what we need. Syriza is waiting in the wings. Now, there's an effective anti-IMF opposition that also doesn't want to leave Europe. Greece can't cease being a part of Europe. Greece has been the center of Europe for all these thousands of years. If you go broke, to be bankrupt, doesn't mean that you're not a European anymore. That would be, Europe would have been gone long ago if bankruptcy had been the main consideration to be a European. You can be bankrupt and be a European too. And above all, what does bankrupt mean? You're going to be declared bankrupt by a ratings agency or a zombie bank that's 10 times more bankrupt than you. So, we'll get back to Greece here in just a second on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Keep up with everything at Tarpley.net. You'll news on how to learn more about the Mormon moment, Bishop Romney's tradition, and also news about the Magniet Festival in Amsterdam, Holland, Friday, the 31st of August, 2012. What should Greece do? Well, you've got to get rid of Samaras. You've got to get Alexis Tsipras in there, right? This is the one model of political activity that has worked in the past couple of years in Europe and the U.S. to get something positive, right? Ron Paul, you can forget it. You're working for a reactionary. You're essentially supporting Romney. Remember, a vote for Ron Paul is a vote for Romney. That's how it worked the whole time. And on the other hand, the Occupy Wall Street, the pathos of this impotence, right, that they got nothing. You can see that the Tea Party is still a concept. They're still, they've got lunatics out there, lunatics though they be. They're still fighting according to their lights. But, of course, the anarchists, right, the ad busters, the David Grabers of the world, all the facilitators and the people who impose that idiotic straitjacket of the consensus method in the General Assembly, this failure, this absolute sellout, well, those have failed. So what has worked is Syriza. So learn something, and don't be a chauvinist. Learn it where you find it. Gold is where you find it. So in this case, I would say the following. First of all, debt moratorium. The Greek debt cannot be repaid. It is a physical impossibility. So the obvious thing to do is to put a debt freeze on that. Hoover moratorium of 1931. If Hoover could do it, so can Greece. You simply want to put a debt freeze on there. You want to focus in particular on derivatives debt. All of that should be frozen and thrown into the shredder or pushing the delete button. So the other thing you need to do is, on a European scale, ban derivatives. You've got to outlaw collateralized debt obligations, outlaw the credit default swaps that are used to attack Greece. If London insists on becoming the world cockpit of credit default swaps, then you've got to put up some protectionist barriers to shut them down. The Wall Street sales tax, in this case the Tobin tax, the financial transfer tax, 1%. Not this tiny tokenism, but something that makes a difference. You've got to shut down the speculative machine that is attacking and devouring Europe. And while you're doing all that, you might as well do Glass-Steagall, too. That would help in that context. Glass-Steagall alone, not enough. Glass-Steagall alone, pathetic as an agitational demand. But if you're going to get all this, you might as well also clean up the mess. Now, this morning on National Pentagon Radio, the Diane Rehm Show, the the International Hour, David Sanger of the New York Times says Greece may now leave the euro, that the mood is against the Greeks, right? Get rid of them. This would be quite a cataclysmic event, and certainly a great defeat for Europe. And anybody making that analysis under these conditions, and anybody demanding it, is, whether they know it or not, working for international finance capital, working for London, working for Wall Street, working for the global 0.1% who run the show. Remember, back in the Panic of 1837, a lot of U.S. states went bankrupt. Nobody ever suggested they should leave the Union because they were bankrupt. It's ridiculous. And, of course, this idea that you're going to leave the euro, it's like dropping out of the convoy in the North Atlantic. And also, back in Panic of 1837 or other examples, there's no connection in the real world between a country becoming insolvent and declaring a debt moratorium and the crisis of the euro. What does one have to do with the other? The reason they're linked is that the hedge fund hyenas and zombie banks in Wall Street and London decide to link them, and they decide to use the Greek crisis as a means of attacking the euro, as well as attacking the bonds of these other countries. So there we are. Now, obviously, at a time like this, looking at the Middle East, you wonder what is with the Anglo-Americans. They are crazy. They're crazy already with Hillary and Obama, but we're getting the word that Hillary is exhausted. Hillary is tired. Maybe her criminal energy is flagging. Suppose you had John Bolton as Secretary of State. Suppose you had John Bolton as Secretary of State. Suppose you had Dan Senor of the Coalition Provisional Authority as UN Ambassador. You get the idea. Robert Joseph, the head of the National Security Council. Suppose you have Robert Kagan as Secretary of the Treasury. I don't know what. This is also going to be a group with greater criminal energy. Now, speaking of criminal energy, when we talk about criminal energy, we got to mention Paul Ryan. Now, last week I put out the analysis, which I stress, that coming from the reactionary Republican Party of Wisconsin and professing the lunatic ideology that he has, Ryan is imbued with the views of the John Birch Society. And I stress that the John Birch Society and the Mormons were virtually indistinguishable, and that the person, or the individual where you can see this personal union, perhaps the clearest, is Cleon Skousen. Cleon Skousen, the author of The Naked Capitalist, the guy who coined the idiotic term, the New World Order. It's not new. It's imperialism. It's the British Empire morphing into the Anglo-American Empire with a few hiccups in between, world wars, whatever. But Cleon Skousen, the main writer, the principal ideologue of the John Birch Society, and the leading exponent of the official right wing of the Mormons, wanted to privatize Social Security. Of course, they're all Roosevelt haters, every one of them. They hate the New Deal. They want to strip the American people of their economic rights. All right, so Ryan, coming from Wisconsin, Appleton, Wisconsin, world headquarters of the lunatic John Birch Society, once a joke, now contending for power, showing the degeneracy of the United States. Ryan is one of them. Now, just to document this from another point of view, here we have the Washington Post style section. Monday, August 20th. Big headline in the style section, "The Willing Lightning Rod. Paul Ryan's stance in daring to touch entitlement reform most accounts for his rise to a bigger stage. Now, here's the idea, that the barbaric proposal of economic genocide against the American people is courageous. It shows intellectual seriousness, say these degenerates at the Washington Post, right? Limbaugh says this is a left-wing newspaper. Guess again, Limbaugh. It's not. So here's the idea. The picture, look, just en passant, the picture is, that accompanies this headline is we see Ryan in the middle of a gaggle of these reactionary parliamentary cretins of the Republican Party, and to his left, to our right in the picture, we see none other than Todd Akin of Missouri, right? The barbarian who shot his mouth off this week and has now led to a political row in the Republican Party and beyond. The other one we see there is Bill Flores of Texas. Those are the three we can identify in this picture. But Ryan is in the middle. But here's the point of this is not this. It's interesting, but the point is the two congressmen that the Washington Post finds, and this is by Michael Leahy, the two congressmen that can tell you most about Ryan are Jason Chaffetz of Utah and Jeff Flake of Arizona. Flake now hoping that he's on his way to become a senator. Now, what's interesting about that is they're both Mormon. There's a Mormon clique in the Congress, and it looks like Paul Ryan is an honorary member of the Mormon caucus in the House. So QED, this is the basis of that affinity and that chemistry between Ryan and Romney. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome to the second hour of World Crisis Radio. Another reminder, take a look at Tarpley.net around the time of Romney's acceptance speech, if you will, and you'll find a way to acquire the report that I've been highlighting for you in the last couple of weeks, right? Bishop Romney's tradition and what the Mormon moment might mean to you. Notice there is an attempt to make this a taboo, and I would urge you don't allow it to be made a taboo. This is perfectly legitimate, right? The U.S. goes around complaining that some governments in the world are reflective of a single ethnic group, right? This is one of the big U.S. arguments against Syria. I think it's specious in that case, but if you get a foreign policy run by neocons and a domestic and economic policy run by Mormons, that's not going to be very good for anybody. So that's a perfectly legitimate political issue. Now, the basic thesis of this research is that Romney's behavior is illuminated by the ideological, cultural, religious, theological, ecclesiastical tradition that he comes from. And again, he's a bishop, and he's really a bishop. He is he's a stake president of the Boston, New England area of the Mormons. That's the equivalent of a bishop. He's got a diocese. He's the head of it. He's a bishop. He's also a bishop in Mormon terms, which is a little bit less than a bishop in the West here, Western civilization, I mean, and it's more like parish priest. But he's definitely a part of it, right? He's got 5 sons. They all went to Brigham Young University. He went to Brigham Young University. They all married Mormon women and all married in the temple. So what's with Romney? Well, the main thing is secrecy. It's a combination of secrecy and hypocrisy. An authoritarianism, an attempt to control free speech and public debate. The most recent one is now some CBS reporter from a local TV station says the Romney campaign tried to tell her what she could not ask. She couldn't ask about abortion. She couldn't ask about Aiken. Well, this is silly. You can't do this. Mrs. Romney, right, Ann says that there will be no more releases, right? You're not going to get anything more about our taxes. So secrecy about Bain Capital. When did you leave? 1999 or 2002, right? You told the FEC, you told 1999, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, you told 2002, 2003. So which is it? Secrecy about Bain, secrecy about taxes, secrecy about the tax returns, secrecy about the overseas tax havens and shelters, right, in 6 to 7 countries. I don't know if I can reel them all off, but you've got the Cayman Islands, you've got Bermuda, you've got Switzerland, you've got Luxembourg, you've got Germany, and there are a couple of others. And all of this is supposed to be secret and remain secret. Well, this is not what you usually get here in the U.S. Secrecy about the horse. That Ann Romney owns horses worth about $250,000, and the cost to keep them in a stable is in the tens of thousands of dollars per year, and her dancing horse, Rafalka, was in the Olympics, but Romney, of course, he wasn't going to look at that. He wasn't going to go to it. So it's all this secrecy. What is this? Well, then you look at the Mormons, right? The temple is secret. You're not allowed to go into it. The liturgy is secret. Not only is the liturgy secret, and this is one of the things that came out in particular of the BBC report with John Sweeney, is that until, according to the people quoted by John Sweeney, ex-Mormons, apostates as they're called, ex-Mormons, until 1990, you had to swear a blood-curdling Freemasonic oath that you would never reveal the secrets of the temple. You would never tell any outsider what had gone on there. I mean, this is like Skull and Bones, or the P2 Lodge, or the Copperheads, right? The Knights of the Golden Circle had similar oaths. And this is complete with these sweeping hand gestures across your throat and across your abdomen. You're willing to have your throat cut, you're willing to be disemboweled, rather than tell the secrets of the temple. Well, what's so secret? The theology is to some extent a secret. I mean, you can get a pretty general idea. The history is also a secret in the sense that documents are withheld, documents are sanitized, documents are not shared. So, serious problems. But you can see where it comes from. If you grow up in a rather cohesive, aggressive sect with a bitter catalog of grievances, this is much more powerful than being a member of some kind of a mainline religion, which is relatively complacent, relaxed, and sated in terms of its position in society and its reputation and so forth. The rap against the Mormons is that they tend to be monolithic, that they all tend to vote in a block. This is one of the things that scared people. It scared them in Missouri. It scared them in Kirtland, Ohio. Well, actually, it was the bankruptcy, right? The financial machinations and shenanigans that went on in Kirtland, Ohio, that got them kicked out. The kind of stuff that Romney does. There's a direct line of development that goes from Romney at Bain Capital back to the days of Kirtland, Ohio. The other interesting thing from the Washington Post this week is there's a profile in the Washington Post of what did Romney do when he was the stake president, especially of the Belmont, Massachusetts operation of the Mormons. And what's clear from this is that there's a close relation of Bain Capital to the LDS Church. These are closely linked, and there are a number of people, not just Romney, but a couple of others. The names will you'll see them in the Washington. You see them in various ways. The top executives of Bain are the Mormons are heavily represented. So it's not just Romney. And the Mormon Church, at one point in this Washington Post article, turns to the people at Bain Capital to get advice. Right, so it's a relationship that doesn't just come out of nowhere. So monolithic and block voting. We have a profile of the Mormons from a couple of years ago here. Let's see if we can find this. The New York Times, at the time of the Salt Lake City Olympics, I'm sorry, this is actually the New Yorker magazine. They went through the demography of Utah. Here's what it looks like. It's a one-party state, but it's the Republicans, but it's the Republicans and the Mormons in Utah. Mormons constitute 63% of Utah's population. All statewide elective offices, from the governor on down, are held by saints. The state legislature is overwhelmingly made up of white Mormon Republican males. 3/4 of the state judiciary is Mormon. The entire United States congressional delegation from Utah is Mormon. This is 2002. It may be slightly different, but I think it's basically accurate. School boards, city councils, municipal agencies, mayor offices, dominated by Mormons. James E. Shellady, editor of the Salt Lake Tribune, which is not the property of the Mormons, but, well, the fact is we live in a quasi-theocracy. 80% of office holders are from a single party. 90% are of a single religion. 99% are of a single race, white, and 85% of one gender. You get the idea. This doesn't look like America. This is not, it's not diverse. It's politically not viable. And as we look at somebody like Brigham Young, what's going on? It's a quest for political power. Money, of course, but power. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Look at Tarpley.net. Keep up to date with everything, including a special report on the Mormon moment, Bishop Romney's tradition, and what this might mean to you. And, of course, do take a look. We might get the details up there of the Magneet Festival in Amsterdam, Holland, Friday, 31st of August. Probably my only European appearance, at least of this season. So we're talking about the secrecy, the hypocrisy, the authoritarianism of the Romney campaign, rooted in this Mormon tradition that he so obviously comes from. Remember, Romney's great-great-grandfather was Parley Pratt, and looking at the sources, there's a consensus that Parley Pratt was one of the main people creating this Latter-day Saints movement. Parley Pratt, Orson Pratt. Now, Joseph Smith and Brigham Young were the top bosses, but in terms of who recruited more members, personally recruited them, Brigham Young set up a recruiting apparatus, but that was done by other people in the front lines. Frontline recruiters, Parley Pratt, the Archer of Paradise, this is the key guy, recruiting tens of thousands of people to Mormonism, according to various scholars. So this is an absolutely critical guy, and that's why Romney is Mormon royalty. He's not royalty because of anybody named Romney. He's royalty because of somebody named Pratt, Parley Pratt, Orson Pratt. So it's monolithic. It's Freemasonic. I guess that's what we have to look at. You look at Brigham Young, carnal, vindictive, violent, obsessed with power, obviously carnal appetites. How many, 60, 70, 80 wives, 50 wives, and so forth, and reactionary. So it's not just political power, but it's reactionary political power, right? It's Cleon Skousen, it's Senator Lee, who thinks that child labor laws are unconstitutional, right? This unbelievable troglodyte reactionary stuff. You look at the senators from Utah, right? Hatch, Garn, Bennett, Lee. This is not a good group. Now there are exceptions. There was one, Frank Moss, who wanted to bring the water system into play, and there are some others. But the general rule is that this is not so good. It can't be as totalitarian as it was, but that is the attempt. So it is a faction. It's a political faction, and that's why you've got to be able to exercise free speech and and talk about this. And by the way, let me also point out, in these television accounts, they say Mormonism is the fastest growing U.S. religion. I don't think this is true. I think the fastest growing is actually Seventh-day Adventism. And what is the advantage of Seventh-day Adventism? It's ironic because both of them are headquartered they're extremely, they have a big center of gravity right here in the Washington suburbs for historical reasons, right? The Marriott hot shops started here near Washington, D.C., or in Washington, D.C., and, of course, the Seventh-day Adventist in Tacoma Park and related areas. The Seventh-day Adventists grow faster because they didn't have the racist theology built in, right? And you see the Mormons are trying very hard to catch up now. You're going to have Mia Love, black woman, candidate for Congress in Utah, and she is going to be the alibi, the token. This is token integration of the congressional delegation, and that she wants to go into the Black Caucus and bust it up. Well, this is fairly obvious what's being done. All right, so in previous broadcasts, we have covered Joseph Smith and his Civil War prophecy, that during the nullification crisis, when South Carolina said they were going to nullify the federal tariff in 1832 and threaten civil war, Joseph Smith predicted a civil war, and above all, he predicted that the southern states would turn to Great Britain. And this, I think, is the absolutely fundamental thing that none of the other accounts has really put into adequate, bold relief, that the Mormons are geopolitically, as well as doctrinally, a tentacle of Great Britain, of British imperialism, of British intelligence. Joseph Smith and the Civil War prophecy, saying that the Confederacy will turn to the British. This is 30 years before Fort Sumter, or 3 decades approximately before Fort Sumter. He's already got the general strategy of the Confederacy, which is to try at any cost to get the British to intervene. Then we have the White Horse prophecy, 1843, 1844, where we've got the White Horse is the Mormons, the Red Horse is the British. They will ally against the Pale Horse, the United States, symbol of death. U.S. brings death. How about that? And then there's the Black Horse, and this is obviously the slaves, the African-American chattel victims of this system. So that's the White Horse prophecy. When the Constitution hangs by a thread, the Mormons will seize power and save the country and go on to rule the world. Now, when Romney was in school at BYU, he was considered the great hope to actually implement the White Horse prophecy. He's got to be asked about this. Then, after 1844, Brigham Young, because of the assassination of Joseph Smith by a mob, introduces the Oath of Vengeance, which is this blood oath of a vendetta against the United States of America, to be passed on to the third and fourth generation, meaning, I think, eternally. That was in the liturgy, in the temple endowment, as they call it, until 1927. There is also, as the BBC with John Sweeney point out, there is this oath of secrecy where you do this gesture, cutting your throat, cutting open your abdomen. That was in the liturgy until 1990. There is the doctrine of blood atonement coming from Brigham Young, which is patently anti-Christian. Under Christianity, the sacrifice of Christ, who was without sin, to save the world, this is the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world, all of them. It is infinite. But Brigham Young says, no, there are some crimes that are too big for that. They go beyond Christ's ability to atone. And what he means is if you kill Joseph Smith, then that's beyond anything else in world history. So blood atonement. You've got to have blood atonement. Now, let's just, we have a number of ways of attacking this. Let's take a minute and look at the Mountain Meadows Massacre. We'll put it in the historical context in a minute, but let's look at the Romney campaign of now and see its connections to the Mountain Meadow Massacre to validate this idea that the tradition is playing a big role. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Keep up with everything at tarpley.net. Take a look there. You'll see a way to get this special report on the Bishop Romney's tradition, and Amsterdam, Holland, on the Friday the 31st of August, the Magnate Festival coming up. I should be on the program. Take a look in advance before you travel. The Mountain Meadows Massacre. It's in the fall of 1857. Now, this is when Brigham Young is acting in cooperation with British geopolitical strategy. Here's how it works. The idea is the U.S. is going to be busted up by secessionism, and the main gambit in secessionism is obviously the Confederate States of America, and this is spawned by Scottish Rite Southern Jurisdiction Freemasons deployed from London through Cincinnati into the southern states. Right, secessionism is a minority coup against an inert or even loyal majority in most of these places, but it's a group that knows exactly what it wants because it's been deployed by the British. So the idea is the United States is going to be put into a nutcracker with four components. The Confederates are number one, and here we have the Scottish Rite Freemasons playing the big role. This is the group that we see with Ron Paul, right? The Dixiecrats, the Strom Thurmonds and the Jesse Helms types. Then, of course, you have Canada. Canada is where the British send troops in 1861 to 1862, and they have a hard time because the St. Lawrence is frozen and they haven't built any railroads. It's not a large British garrison, but it's significant, and it would tie down a lot. So the Confederates in the south, the Canadians in the north. Further south, Mexico, where you got a French army, is in Mexico, and that French army could come marching in to help the Confederates against the Union. And then the fourth element of this pincer is the Mormons in Utah, and this is the geopolitical purpose of it. Remember, the peak of the power of the British Empire is it's between 1815 and 1870 or so in general, but specifically it's in the 22-year period, 1848 to 1870. Call it 2 decades. That's the high point of the British Empire, and that's when they attack everybody in sight. The British, the French, of course, Napoleon III is installed as a stooge of London, and it's interesting. People don't understand this. I'm listening to a Carol Quigley tape. He doesn't seem to understand that Napoleon III is somebody working for Lord Palmerston. That's how he wrote a book about it, right? Napoleonic ideas. The big mistake of Napoleon, the original one, is to go against the British. If you just work for the British and with them, writes Napoleon III, then you're going to be fine. 1848 revolutions, Metternich overthrown, Germany destabilized, everybody in Central Europe destabilized, all kinds of monarchies tumble, but above all Metternich, because that's the center of the arbitrary powers, right? The Holy Alliance. So the British destabilized that. That means everybody in Europe is weakened. This is very much like the Arab Spring. We talked about it at the time. So the 1848 revolution. Then we have the French acting as Continental Dagger with the British, with the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia attacking Russia. The Crimean War is part of this. The Great Mutiny, or Sepoy Mutiny in India, is a part of it. The French send an army to Mexico. The French send an army to Indochina. The Spanish come back and take over Santo Domingo, right? Dominican Republic and Haiti today. And the British are attacking China with 3 opium wars. So this is the British massive imperialist offensive. And the plan for the U.S. is what I said. Crush the U.S. between the Confederates, the Canadians with British troops, the French army in Mexico, and the Mormons in the Great Basin. And there's plenty of connections. Go and read what John Stuart Mill writes about the Mormons in On Liberty. He essentially says, oh, yeah, the Mormons, they get a bad press, but it's wrong to shut them down, because he says, after all, everybody can leave. Yeah, John Stuart Mill knew very well, because of the sensationalist literature, which was all over the place. One of the great traditions of the mid-19th century is horror stories, especially from women, about their experiences in the polygamous harems and seraglios of Brigham Young and the Mormons, right? And there's a whole literature about this. So by the late 1850s, John Stuart Mill knew damn well that if you were a woman or a dissenter, you could not get out of Deseret. And then later on, just discovered an unpublished essay by Thomas Carlyle about the Mormons, where he says that Brigham Young is his model of leadership. Brigham Young is a model of an authoritarian guy who gets things done. And he says this is exactly what it is. He builds consensus by leading and getting things done. And the argument is very much like Mussolini is good because he makes the trains run on time. He doesn't tolerate disorder or dirt or confusion or inefficiency. He gets things done. And therefore, writes Carlyle, we envy the Mormon government. We British need basically a new Cromwell. I think that's what Carlyle sees, is a new Oliver Cromwell in the form of Brigham Young. So there's a British literature at the level of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, A Study in Scarlet, right? The first of the Sherlock Holmes books is about people trying to get out from under the dictatorship of Brigham Young. Robert Louis Stevenson also somewhat negative on the Mormons, but the elite writers, the writers who really speak for the top levels of British intelligence, Mill, John Stuart Mill, and Thomas Carlyle, these are essentially defending the Mormons. Dickens also in The Uncommercial Traveler. We have Dickens gets on a boat, he visits a ship before it leaves the harbor full of Mormons, and he says, oh, how wonderful they are, how orderly they are. The thing that doesn't seem to disturb him is a distraught mother comes along and she says, where's my daughter, where's my daughter, have you kidnapped her? And Dickens writes, the Mormons didn't seem to be too interested in helping her. Well, that is something of a problem, isn't it? If you were a parent, I think you'd see it somewhat differently. Normally, Dickens very much interested in family values, but here not. So Dickens, Carlyle, Mill, British intelligence, pro-Mormon, and with good reason. So now, the Mountain Meadows Massacre. In 1857, Brigham Young thinks that a civil war is about to break out in the United States. And he thinks this, I would say, because you've got bleeding Kansas, right, under the Stephen Douglas Democratic Party policy of squatter sovereignty or territorial sovereignty in the territories, popular sovereignty. The situation in Kansas is you've got armed gangs, you've got the Confederate or pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri, and then you've got the abolitionists, John Brown being the most famous, and they're killing each other. They're killing each other at the rate of 50 or 100 in a year or two. It's not a war, but it's widespread terrorism. So John Brown in 1857 is known to be recruiting for his attack on Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. Now, Virginia at that time. So here's the idea. John Brown is backed by this group called the Secret Five, which is a group of Boston and New York bankers, Tappan, Forbes, people like this. These are oligarchs. These are people who are working hand in glove with the British. And you can see that the goal of these people is a lot of them are descendants of the New England secessionists of the 1812 era, and they would essentially like to have the U.S. split up, right? For their own reasons, they would like to promote the split up of the U.S. So it looks like Brigham Young thinks that the Kansas and the John Brown Harper's Ferry are going to come together in 1857 to 1858. His problem is that he gets a little bit too far out in front of events, and we'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Last reminder, check Tarpley.net at the time of Romney's acceptance speech Wednesday, Thursday next week. Should be something about Bishop Romney's tradition if you're interested in further reading. And if you're in Western Europe, Amsterdam in particular, Friday, 31st of August, the Magnet Festival should include yours truly. So in 1855, President Franklin Pierce of Young America, right, Mazzini, appointed a governor of Utah Territory who was not a Mormon. And at this point, Brigham Young decided to implement his phased plan for secession, and this involved gearing up, right? He tried to foment an Indian rebellion. The Congress is the Constitution is absolutely explicit that Congress has the power to govern the territories. But Brigham Young, very interesting, he always says, I love the Constitution. The Constitution is divinely inspired. But then when you get down to every provision, he says, I love the Constitution, but the Congress cannot govern Utah territory. We have to do it under popular sovereignty, and that's it. So don't send any judges or federal officials. He also, as you'll see very soon, he tries to close the borders of Utah so that you can't come in or out without an internal passport. This is also explicitly forbidden. So in the mid-1850s, he's building up, and he starts this reign of terror called the Mormon Reformation, where he has, self-criticism sessions, rectification sessions. This is when he brings in the blood atonement. He's got the Danites, the militia, and the Shenpips. The Shenpips being the exterminating angels, and they go to work on any dissenters. So he's firming up the home front. Buchanan, of course, Buchanan is a doughface. He's pro-Confederate, but he does pull himself together, or probably with ulterior motives, to start this up. August 11th, 1857, Brigham Young tells a cheering crowd in Salt Lake City, I have fixed my determination not to let any federal troops into this territory, and unless the government assumes a more pacific attitude, I declare immigration by the overland route stopped. Okay, that's secessionism. So Buchanan then decides to send a group of federal troops. This is a pathetic exercise because the general that he puts in charge of it is Albert Sidney Johnston, who is a Confederate, and he's not going to fight secessionism because he's already thinking about secessionism himself. So in the middle of all this, after Brigham Young had said, don't you dare come in or out of Deseret without my special written permission, my safe conduct, or my internal passport, we get the Fancher-Baker party coming from Arkansas. 140 peaceful Arkansas travelers, or thereabouts. The family names, Fancher, Baker, Cameron, Jones, Dunlap, Mitchell, Huff, Tackett, Miller, Woods, from northwest Arkansas, not so far from Texas, from East Texas. Brigham Young calls John D. Lee, his honorary son, tells him, you got to pitch into some of these people, you got to make an example. So they kill 140 people, and this is done. They claim, the Mormons claim, that it was done by the Indians, but then, of course, the problem is that the people are all killed by gunfire, and these poor Indians, impoverished as they are, have very few guns, not enough to do this entire operation. Now, the reason for picking this Arkansas group is that Parley Pratt, he had 11 wives. Parley Pratt had 11 wives, but he decided he needed a 12th wife. So he decided to steal the wife of a guy from Arkansas. And the guy from Arkansas took violent exception to Parley Pratt taking his wife and the children and putting them in this harem. So he killed Parley Pratt. Now, this, of course, this requires blood atonement, right? This is a crime of passion according to many legal systems, but no, got to have blood atonement. So Parley Pratt he's hoist by his attempt to get the 12th wife. This is the great-grandfather of Mitt Romney and the one that put the Romney family on the map. So the word is then spread among the Mormons that the Arkansas party are not only the people who killed Parley Pratt, but some of them are also the people that killed Joseph Smith in Nauvoo, Illinois, back in 1844. So they're killed. Now, let's connect the Mormon massacre. Well, first of all, we'd say if the Mountain Meadows massacre is the Trojan War, then the Paris of the piece, Paris meaning the guy who goes and steals the woman and starts the fighting, That's Parley Pratt, because he went and stole the Arkansas guy's wife, and that's the root of the conflict. But then we need to factor in people who are around Romney today that he's chosen, right? Maybe you say, oh, he can't choose Parley Pratt. All right, let's look at his transition boss. Let's look at his probable future White House chief of staff. That's Mike Leavitt. Now, three things about Mike Leavitt. First of all, building up to the 2007th anniversary, there was forensic research done at the site of the Mountain Meadows massacre, and it was found that most of the human remains showed that people had been killed by guns, including children, babies, killed by guns. It means not by Indians, but by Mormon gunmen. As soon as Mike Leavitt, who was then the governor of Utah, saw what was going on, he said, oh, this is torture for the families. We need closure. Bury everything immediately. Take all the human remains and inter them, and that's the end of it. In other words, a cover-up to hide the enormity of what the Mormons under Brigham Young had done, killing all these people, including these very young children, shooting them. Number two, in 1999, building up to the Salt Lake City Olympics, question of polygamy came up. A lot of world attention on Utah. Leavitt, the transition boss and probable future White House chief of staff, says that polygamy is covered as religious freedom. No. The religious opinion, you can have anyone you want. But when it becomes an overt act, then it is subject to applicable law. All religions are subjected to the needs of law and order. And therefore, since this polygamy is illegal in the United States, this is not the case. So Leavitt had endorsed polygamy basically in 1999. He's now on his way to become the White House chief of staff. How does that grab you? And the third one, when Romney boasts of his work in saving the Olympics, he didn't go there to save the Olympics. He went there to save the Mormon hierarchy. Because the story was that in building up to the Salt Lake City to get the bid for the Winter Olympics, the saints, the Mormon saints and the Mormon hierarchy, gave out about $1 million worth of bribes to officials of the International Olympic Committee in the form of tuition, remission, and other payments. And the most obvious person who was going to go to jail in this was Mike Leavitt, the current transition boss and the current chief of staff. The people who took the fall, Dave Johnson, top Mormon, and Thomas Welch. They were essentially scapegoated. Well, they were guilty, but they took the entire fall for the higher-ups. The case was then dismissed by Judge Sam. Think of him as Son of Sam. The Mormon judge, Judge Sam, U.S. Federal District Judge Sam, a Mormon. The Son of Sam threw the case out. So Dave Johnson and Thomas Welch got off. But Johnson and Welch loudly stated that what was going on was a cover-up and that Mike Leavitt was heavily implicated. And you can read Romney's book. Romney wrote a book about this, telling how great he is, called Turnaround. And even Romney says the governor, Mike Leavitt, was widely accused. We can see this in other published sources. The New Yorker story has the same thing. So what Romney was doing was covering up for Leavitt and who? The first president of the church, the quorum of the 12 apostles, and so forth. So the Mountain Meadows massacre is not a dead issue, but it lives in the Romney campaign, and above all, through the choice of Mike Leavitt, transition boss and probable future White House chief of staff. The American people have got to learn these things. You can't make an informed choice unless you're aware of the historical background. So we'll see you next week on World Crisis Radio. Wednesday, Thursday, around the time that Mitt makes his acceptance speech, we should be offering a written report composed under the pressure of obvious time constraints, but still a report on Bishop Romney's tradition. Bishop Romney. He is a bishop. Now, there is a quibble about what it means to be a bishop. A Mormon bishop is apparently in charge of a single church or ward, I think. The Mormon bishop looks more like a parish priest. He's the one who's going to intervene directly on individuals and harass them, guide them, whatever you want. But then Romney also became a stake president. And the stake, meaning a stake in the tent of Zion, the stake president that's a bishop in normal Western civilization. The stake is the equivalent of a diocese in traditional Christianity, and if you're the head of a diocese, that makes you a bishop. So Romney really is a bishop by any count. He's called a bishop, but again, the Mormon bishop is a step below what we have in Western civilization. But then becoming a stake president, that makes him a full-fledged bishop. So we want to look at Bishop Romney's tradition, the one he claims to love, the one he claims has shaped him, the one he claims to be devoted to, doesn't want to talk about, but nevertheless, there it is. So that's number one. Check tarpley.net at the middle of next week, and we hope to have something to throw into the world historical scales. The other thing here is, naturally, we got an array of television reports on the Mormons. I just mentioned three. ABC News this past week had two separate segments, a two-part profile of the Mormon religion in the ABC Evening News. Of course, these are all cover-ups. Then we had last night, Thursday, the 23rd of August, we had Rock Center with Brian Williams and Harry Smith, Mormon in America. And we also had the BBC with John Sweeney. This was somewhat more aggressive. Well, after NBC, ABC, and BBC, try tarpley.net, and you will see that it's quite different. And it's not so superficial. It's not such a meager public relations account, because there's a cover-up going on. But the one thing that emerges from this that is not hidden is that we're approaching the Mormon moment. The Mormon moment, a moment of affirmation, a moment of, getting back at people. We have to look into this. Therefore, you have to ask yourself whether you want to be part of a Mormon moment, whether there's any place for you in a Mormon moment. So we'll be dedicating quite a bit of today's program to this. Now, the other thing is, if you're in Western Europe on Friday, August 31st, I am likely to be speaking in Amsterdam at the Magneet Festival. Magneet, M-A-G-N-E-E-T, the Magneet Festival, the Magnetic Festival in Amsterdam, Netherlands, Holland, Friday, 31st of August. Should be with my old friend Daniel DeWitt. Daniel DeWitt will be there with me, I believe, and this is likely to be the only European appearance this season. So if you're interested, come on out, and I'll try to have some books. I'll try to have some other things going on. It looks like it's going to be an interview about Syria, and then a presentation about the world economic crisis and what to do about it. So, two things. Again, middle of next week, if you're anywhere in the world, take a look at tarpley.net. There should be then the announcement, indeed the availability, that this report on the Mormons has started to ship, Bishop Romney's tradition, what it's likely to be called, and then the Magneet Festival, Friday, the 31st of August. Do check up in advance, call in advance. It's not 100%, but it's becoming more and more likely as the days pass. All right, so here we are, a couple of days before the quadrennial Republican convention. What do we have? Well, first of all, from Obama, probably the most explicit war threat that we've had from Obama in quite a while, certainly the most explicit war threat that we've had from Obama about Syria. This was one of his, was actually the White House appearance where he was taking advantage of the raving. Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley reporting from Washington, D.C. It's Friday, the 24th of August. And, of course, on Monday, we have the Republican National Convention. They've been going on since 1856. At the beginning, with Fremont in 1856, and with Lincoln in 1860 and 1864. They were pretty much the opposite of what they are today. In those days, this was a party with revolutionary aims. On a world historical scale, the Republican Party was the architect of the second and indispensable American Revolution, known as the Civil War, to wipe out the slave power conspiracy, to break the power of the slavocrats, and also to create one of the greatest land reforms ever seen, the Homestead Act, the Morrill Act, Justin Morrill, a great guy. So we got all that, but of course it's turned into its opposite, hasn't it? Now we're going to get Romney. It's interesting that in 1856, one of the first things the Republican Party did was to say, we want to put an end to the two relics of barbarism, the twin relics of barbarism, says the Republican platform of 1856, slavery and polygamy. Actually, I think they put polygamy and slavery, meaning Confederates and Mormons. And now the Mormons are going to take over the Republican Party. What a shame, how things turn into their opposites through all kinds of influences. Now, first of all, let me urge you to look at tarpley.net by about the middle of next week of the reactionary, really barbarian ideologue Todd Akin, the Tea Party fanatic, Tea Party barbarian from the Republican Party. We don't need to go into that guy's raving remarks, but this is what brought Obama out, right, to get the most out of this. But in the course of appearing to talk about the barbarian Akin, he also got off a war threat, which was that if the Syrian government moves or uses chemical weapons, then the U.S. will attack, invade, go in with troops. Obviously, a sickening reminiscence, a sickening atavism of the Mad Dog Bush, the younger administration, right? The chemical weapons in Iraq, the WMD of Saddam Hussein. Here it is again. The red line is supposedly the chemical weapons, and we've got stories now that U.S. special forces all around the Middle East are on high alert to intervene in Syria. Now, again, this may not be the cakewalk that these forces have somehow become accustomed to. It might become much more complicated than they think. All good reasons not to do it, to back off from this stuff. The other obvious potential here is you've got al-Qaeda terrorists now running around there in large numbers. You've got Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. You've got the various Liwa groups, the brigades, the Islamic brigades, and so forth. If they get a hold of some chemical weapons and shoot them off, then that becomes a perfect false flag Gulf of Tonkin. So a word to the wise is sufficient on that. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio.